Right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our jobs.ac.uk webinar, and today we're discussing career opportunities in student support in higher education. So a big welcome from me. My name is Gillian Hamnett and I'm the Director of Student Welfare and Support Services at the University of Oxford. And we have a fantastic panel with us today. I'm going to ask them to just quickly introduce themselves, and then we have a few questions that have been pre-submitted, but otherwise please do put your questions in the chat, and if things come up or follow-up questions arise, please do put those in the chat. Okay, so if I could start with Lorna. Lorna, could you please introduce yourselves to everyone here?
Hi there everyone, good afternoon. My name is Lorna Quickfall and I'm the Manager of Student Welfare for the School of Economics at the University of Edinburgh. My role offers pastoral and academic support. I sit between the teaching office, the lecturers, and the more specialised university services of student disability and student counselling.
Fantastic. And Benedict.
Hi everyone. So yeah, my name is Benedict and I'm the Head of Student Experience at Aston University. I've worked in higher education in a variety of roles for going on about 10 years now. I think I would describe myself as an HE generalist, in the sense that there's very few support services departments that I haven't been involved in. So I've variously been involved in community relations, careers, chaplaincy work, accommodation teams, currently involved in timetabling and student funding and advice. So there's kind of not many areas of central support provision I haven't tried at one time or another, which I guess is actually part of the fun and the opportunity that we're here to talk about today.
Great, thank you. And Phil, could you go next?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Phil Scarf. I'm Head of Student Welfare at De Montfort University. I apologise in advance. I've got a furry co-worker with me today who is prone to barking, so if that happens, apologies. So the services that I run are sort of central student support services, a wide range of different things they cover, so disability, mental health, counselling, international student support, safeguarding, students at risk, domestic violence, hate, international support, chaplaincy, links with the GP, and at the moment are being massively dominated by the university's response to COVID. So quite a few things to keep busy.
Lovely. And Jordan, last but not least.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm the Head of Operations at King's Academy, the Educational Development Team at King's College London. Previously held a role at Aston, similar to my ex-colleague and still friend Benedict, and further similar to him, have held multiple roles in universities, many of which related to student support or the student experience, whether that be directly to student services, careers, or creating a project management office of students. In my last role, I came into HE kind of accidentally, which I think you'll find is quite common for many people in HE, and started out as a sabbatical officer looking after education and welfare, and then found myself stepping over the fence to work at the institution. Yeah, so very much generalist, have had many different experiences with project-based work, and have worked both in the UK and internationally in HE, and can guarantee you every single university is different, varying cultures, staff experiences, priorities, all have their own mark, and it's a cool sector to work in.
Great, thank you. And I'll just say a few words about myself. So I came to higher education and student support work after doing a few other things, including working in the prison service and in web design, both of which are good transferable skills for working in student services. And I've worked in student support roles for about 10 or 11 years now, covering registry, running services like libraries, but also running welfare services as well, and some funding and sort of hardship services too. So currently, like Phil and Lorna, very much in the student welfare area, and responsible for services like mental health support, counselling, disability advisory services, specialist services like sexual harassment and hate crime, and also very busy with the university's response to COVID, because everything appears to be welfare related at the moment. So we will try to do our business as usual as well as everything else. Okay, so let's start with a couple of the pre-submitted questions, and I would also please encourage you to put more questions in the chat. But let's start with a question we've had pre-submitted, and we'll get thoughts from our various panelists. So this is quite a broad one, but it's asking about what the key skills and qualifications and or work experience are to work in student services, and thinking specifically people who've come from a different sector and are sort of trying to break into student services. So skills, qualifications, and work experience, or just some thoughts about how you would approach applying if you were coming from outside the sector. So can we start with Benedict?
Hi. So yeah, it was interesting actually. We were just kind of talking about this briefly before we went live today, and I think one of the key points is clearly, you know, everyone should be aware I'm going to talk about transferable skills, and that is very, very key. I think one of the benefits of higher education is there are roles that even within sort of the support services field that can be so incredibly varied. So, you know, student support services isn't just one thing. And so that might be that you want to look for a role in student support that's very, very student focused and very, very kind of frontline customer facing. Or it might be that you're looking for something that's sort of much more administrative, and you're possibly not going to be quite so high profile in terms of student engagement. And I think having the opportunity there to actually find a niche within student services that actually plays to your existing skills shouldn't, well, again, it'll obviously depend on the requirements of particular institutions, but the advantage of it is there's not that kind of specific area where you're going to be looking at a job in higher education that says you must have direct experience of doing this exact role somewhere else. I think that would kind of be the key for me.
And Lorna, any thoughts about how you would approach this coming from a different sector?
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. Benedict is completely right. That's the thing. There's no one student support role. I come from a background in secondary education. I was a teacher for many years and involved in pastoral support in secondary education. And the key kind of skills that roll over are reactivity. I know that every university has its own culture and its own systems, but I think that that's definitely a key one because a lot of things happen, pandemics, for example. So things like reactivity, empathy, creativity. But Benedict's completely right. It's a wonderful field with many different niches and opportunities in it to help students. Helping students doesn't necessarily mean doing face-to-face work with them. It can mean project-based things. It can mean driving forward initiatives. So I think if you've got a desire to kind of work in this area, there will be part of that area that may work very well with the skills and the experience that you bring from a different sector.
I would also just add that my colleagues who come from various different other sectors, so for example from the charity or third sector who've worked in supporting other groups before, or from example from a citizens advice background, that one is very transferable, but also colleagues with a legal background or a policy background who then want to come into student services. I think there's a lot of scope for people with attention to detail in this in this area. Phil, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I mean, people have mentioned various different backgrounds people might come from. I mean, personally, my background was in social work, and I think we have a lot of colleagues who come from other sort of health and associated health backgrounds. So sometimes CPNs, OTs, that sort of thing. I mean, then there are roles like dyslexia tutors, where there are specific qualifications you would need, but you know, I would reflect what people said. There's such a wide range of roles. and I haven't been particularly sponsored to say this, but I'd have a look on jobs.ac.uk and have a look at specifically what the person specs are asking for. And it was interesting, we were having a conversation beforehand, and one of the things that I would have said, and I still think is valid, is when you're writing an application, don't leave people to read between the lines. So if you are writing an application, look at what the person spec asks for and spell out how you meet the person spec, but give examples of how you meet the person spec. Don't just say that you can do something, give examples of when you've done it. But Lorna was pointing out that, you know, sometimes people can take these things particularly literally. So I think what I would say is have a look at the person spec, have a long, hard think about what the person spec says. Can you create an argument as to how you meet things on the person spec? If you can, then it's probably, you know, a role that it might be worth you thinking about applying for.
And Jordan, just sort of thinking about your career moves, you talked about your sort of path through through student services and higher education. Have you had any kind of moments where you've thought maybe I don't meet the criteria for this job, or and how you've tackled that, or if you weren't sure about whether to apply?
Absolutely. I think echoing what everyone else has already said, I think one of the best things about HE, which Benedict told me once before I applied for my job at King's, was that it is explicit as it comes, and if you answer each question on the person spec, you should at least get considered for an interview, but you never know who else you're up against. But no, in terms of my own journey, for want of a better term, yeah, certainly the job I went for in King's Academy at KCL, it sounded great, it sounded like a lot of fun. And then I went through that specification, made sure I met all the essential criteria, thought about examples, mapped it out, and then again for the desirable. But where there were gaps, or where it was a bit of a bit of a reach, or that I might have been duplicating, I maybe considered what I would try to do within the role, within that. So if, you know, whilst I don't have loads of experience in this particular thing, I can't think of an example right off the top of my head, but something specific that only happens in HE, of which there's plenty, then thinking about what I would go and do based on the research, what it says on the website, the strategy, to try and fill the gap. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Can I ask the panel as a sort of open question? How do you respond when somebody phones you up and says, "Can we just have a chat about this job?" Is that something you would encourage applicants to do?
Yeah, I'd say so for sure.
Yeah, I think it's the reason I got an interview, to be honest. Mm-hmm. Always, if there's a phone number or an email and a name is there to be contacted, why not? I think if they like you on the phone, they're probably going to invite you for an interview.
And it's certainly what I did before getting this job. There was a phone number, I had questions, and I phoned up and had a lovely long conversation. So I think the overwhelming answer is an affirmative on that one. You've got nothing to lose by getting in touch and having a conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that you're buying as well as selling, aren't you? And so what is it that, if you have questions about exactly what the job would look like, this is your chance to have them answered, rather than getting there and discovering it's not quite what you wanted or how it was for you.
Yeah, no, I think a good job interview is a lot like a conversation anyway. This is it's almost exactly the same principle, just in a less formal setting. And obviously the benefit there is you're managing the expectations of the person calling as well, to make sure they understand exactly what the role is and what it involves before they then put the time and effort into the application. And that's also the good, I think.
And I would certainly add to that as, you know, when I'm involved in recruitment, I thoroughly welcome and enjoy those phone calls. I think it's really helpful if someone can show interest, ask questions, be open enough to say, I don't understand what is meant by this, because those are skills that are very helpful to demonstrate. I don't think anyone's ever going to lose face by appearing vulnerable, but I think that can be something that people step back from, especially in applying to a job. Impression management dictates that we kind of want to look like we understand what something means. And certainly as a manager, speaking to someone, I would much rather they asked than tried to
blag it.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, Lorna. I mean, I think so when you're writing a person spec or a job description, you write it, you know, thinking you're trying to be as clear as you possibly can be. If people don't understand what that has said, don't assume if you're an applicant that's your failing. It may be that we've written the person spec or job description in a way which doesn't make it that clear. But also, you know, it's a very brief document, so we'll be using shorthand for things which are very specific to higher education. So what we're not trying to do is kind of trip you up and find kind of fault. So if you don't understand, you know, what a particular acronym or something means within a document, then phone us or ask us, and you know, that's not going to count against you.
And higher education is chronic for acronyms. We're always using acronyms sort of left, right, and centre, and it's not always very inclusive. Phil, whilst we have you on the mic, can you offer any advice about in the kind of jobs that you recruit for, how applicants could judge how important these criteria are? Sometimes they're presented in a slightly random list in job descriptions. How is that something that you could explore on the phone with an applicant?
Well, yes. So, I mean, I think it would depend where you're applying to. So people will, as you say, have different ways of sort of articulating things. Certainly at the Montfort University, we try to separate out what are the essential criteria and what are the desirable criteria. What I would say about the essential criteria, so there may be, for some roles, as I mentioned, an essential qualification. So if there's an essential qualification, like that you have a specific counselling qualification or something like that, if you haven't got that, it doesn't matter how good your application is, you're not going to get an interview. But then in the essential criteria, bear in mind, there are very few candidates who meet perfectly all the essential criteria. So don't be put off if you think I can't meet all of those. We very rarely appoint people who meet all the essential criteria on day one. So if you know think that you mostly meet the essential criteria and you know, as was mentioned before, may have transferable skills that are relevant to the others, then you know that's good. And then the ones that are listed as desirable will be you know, good if you've got them, but not quite so important. I suppose also the way, it's just sort of human nature to some extent, the way people write documents, it's probably there'd probably be more important things at the beginning in the job description rather than at the end. So you know, particularly kind of focus on the first things people are writing. They may well be particularly important.
Because we've got those down first, haven't we?
Well, absolutely,
yeah. Okay, I can see we've got a really great contribution in the chat, so everyone on the panel can see this. So a colleague who is a manager at London University, overseeing Student Inquiry Centre's programme support. And so a couple of questions here rolled into one, but tips for someone looking to step up into a senior role, being a head of student services. And in that vein, skill sets, knowledge, relevant experience, and then the question about how easy is it to transition. So let's take our fences one at a time. Tips for someone moving into a senior role. So I'll start, and then other colleagues can join in. So I'm one for doing a SWOT analysis on myself. So I'll look at the job description, and exactly as Phil said, I'll look at the essential and the desirable, and then I'll think, okay, what do I have and what do I don't have, and how important do I think the don't haves are versus the do haves, and then are there even if I'm not ready for this right now, are there things I could do so that I would be ready in 6 months' time, or I would be ready in a year? So when I went into my previous role, which was a slightly broader one with more types of student services, but for a smaller college, so only about sort of 700 to 1,000 students rather than 24,000 that I have now, and I did not have a lot of the budgeting and financial planning experience. I just didn't have it because of my previous roles having been a bit too junior or having not really been in that space. And so I recognised that as a gap and made a point of trying to fill it, both at work by talking to my colleagues in the finance department, trying to get a bit more involved in some of the planning decisions, and asking my boss if I could be a bit more involved, but also in some of the voluntary and charity work that I do, trying to get more involved in the finances there, so that I at least could understand what a balance sheet looked like, and kind of not look completely confused when presented with expenditure sheets and that kind of thing. So there are, moving into a head of services role, you have to start thinking quite a lot more strategically and longer term than you do when you're delivering often on the operational side. But thinking about what do you have, where have you had to plan, 3-5 years ahead, and to what extent could you develop and build on that. But you need to be really honest with yourself, because you'll be caught out immediately if you try to blag that one, claiming that you've had experience doing financial planning and then falling apart at the sight of Oracle financials or whatever it is. Does anyone else have any thoughts about the sort of the skill sets and areas to develop to move into a more senior role?
Yeah.
Lorna.
See if I can sorry, the social etiquette online is new to us all. So I think I would add to that, it's so important, like Gillian says, to kind of identify what you have and what you can bring. But I would counsel that with potentially looking at what it is you're trying to achieve. What is the senior leadership role? Are you going for it because it's there and it's an opportunity? Is it something that's going to be right for you? And I say this as someone that's kind of been in a variety of different kind of leadership and management roles in different organizations over the years. And it can be, you need to kind of understand what it is that you enjoy about your job. And something is only a step up if it's a step up for you as an individual. Because certainly something that I found in some of the leadership roles that I went into is it took me away from the reasons why I'd gotten into education in the first place, which was students. And I found myself very much more embroiled in human resources and other things that were interesting and exciting for a time, but ultimately weren't why I'd gone into it. So it's also really worth, when you're looking for the next step up, look for the appropriate one that's really going to kind of meet what it is that you want from your career.
Yeah, thank you. Phil, have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, so I mean, what's kind of interesting about that? So I mean, I obviously don't know where you work or how it works where you are, but I mean, as a senior manager, head of department, I'm always looking for opportunities to delegate things because I'm far too busy. And the reality of going into senior role is, if you're not far too busy, then, well, I'd be really surprised if anybody would be saying that, frankly. You're going to be incredibly busy. So I would suspect that you might find, if you were to approach a more senior manager within your division and say, look, I'm interested in developing my potential to take on a role like that. What can you give me to do? What can you delegate to me that might kind of fit within that? So I would look for opportunities, looking at what people have said about where your gaps might be, perhaps talking to, more senior managers in your organisation and being frank with them about, this is where I think my gaps are there opportunities I could get involved in? I mean, if you worked for me and you came to me and said that, I'd probably give you a hug. Well, not in COVID times, obviously, but you know, generally. So I'd try that.
And Benedict, any thoughts about the experience of transitioning into the senior role?
Yeah, no, just a few actually. Just been making notes as we go actually, but I promise I won't. I think there's a saying that I was told by a very experienced coach a while ago, which was that good luck is the crossroads where preparation meets opportunity. And even if there aren't immediate opportunities to move into your next position, there's certainly all the time in the world to do that preparation work. And I think it's that idea of kind of positioning yourself, being ready to take that step when the opportunity arises. And I think that can happen. That can happen in a number of ways. I think one of which is sort of getting involved with things that are perhaps outside of your immediate remit. And I mean, some of this is going to be to do with obviously your organization's own approach to development and the busyness of your role and the flexibility of your manager. But one of the beautiful things about higher education is all these sort of soft power structures that exist alongside the more formal committees. So things like getting involved with things like equality, diversity and inclusion forums, any particular staff working groups or projects that might be happening, or even if it's something that doesn't really sound like it's going to excite anyone very much, like the health and safety forums. And you're doing a few things there, which is you're building your network internally and you're also kind of upskilling yourself at the same time, so that when those opportunities do arise, you're a name, you're a face that's kind of people are aware of. Also, I think there's that question of whether you'd be prepared to go out to go up. You know, if an organization that you're in doesn't have a particularly high turnover at senior levels, then it might be that eventually you're looking to move to a different organization. So there might be a geographical bit of positioning that needs to be considered as well. And I think just to sort of emphasize Lorna's point, I think it's almost a shame in many respects that somehow getting ahead in this sector does involve moving into management, and management isn't necessarily the thing you love about what you do now. And I think that's something that's very, very key, something to bear in mind. Doesn't mean you should go for it, but just to be aware that actually it's not going to be, it doesn't mean you're doing the same job, but more. It's a different skill set and it's a different type of approach. So I guess the take home there would be just to focus on being good at the job you're in as well. Focus on your own competence in the role that you're in, rather than viewing it as this stepping stone to something else, because you don't know quite exactly what that other thing else is going to look like. So there's just a kind of few loosely grouped thoughts on that area, I think.
Yeah, super. Okay. And Jordan, if I can come to you, do you have the experience of transitioning and any particular challenges of transitioning, particularly in relation to other colleagues or the team you used to be in? You mentioned that you'd come from the student union and then into the institution. Maybe we could talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm trying to gather what to say first. Been picking up from Benedict's point about preparation. Absolutely. You have all the time in the world to always be thinking about what you want to do next, but don't do too much because you get exhausted, and you can become a bit despondent. But every time I've kind of went for a different role, I've planned it out. I've done SWOT analysis like yourself, Gillian. I've done visioning exercises from like coaching and whatnot. And ultimately, I've kind of thought, what is it I want to make the move for? And therefore then working from that, going on to, jobs.ac.uk to look at what's available, sometimes finding there's nothing there that I want because I haven't done that research and that reflection. In terms of transitioning, I think there's a lot of power to be really open and honest and just say, I don't really understand this bit, can you say a bit more about it? Or somewhat going back to an earlier point raised by one of the attendees, the very question, sorry, actually speaking, depending on your relation to your manager and your colleagues and other influential people who might guide your career, saying honestly, I want to step up at some point in the future. I want to start planning out that trajectory and that step, and asking for their help and their advice. I was ill on the day of my own interview for King's, and I went into Aston, went to my manager and said, how do I look? She said, "You look great." I was like, "Really?" She's like, "You look like crap." And I was like, "What do I do?" And she gave me some great advice about how to still go to the interview, but how to not make it come across that I was leaning on my illness as my potential failure. Yeah, so and having that really good relationship was absolutely pivotal, like in any sector really. But if you've got those key friends in your workplace, if you've got a great relationship with your manager or anyone else who could give you that that second view, then lean on that and start prepping yourself for the role as soon as you want. And before you know it, you'll start knowing what to go for, what opportunities to look for, and where the gaps need to be filled, and where you might get involved in running a conference, joining a network, running a network, or just, you know, simply throwing out an application, getting the experience, and then eventually landing the job. And also, you don't want to be able to do everything when you arrive, because you should be aiming higher. Hence, if you don't meet some criteria, that's probably a good thing.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Jordan. There's no point in applying for a job if you can already do it all, because it's not going to challenge you. I would just say, don't ever volunteer for the parking space committee, which I accidentally did once, and I'll never get that time back. Okay, some more really good contributions in the live questions. So one from Amy here. Do many people go into higher education not straight from university themselves, I guess is what that question means. And perhaps I'll ask Lorna to start with this one, because Lorna, you said you had spent many years as a teacher in secondary. And is it your experience that your colleagues are also in that boat?
I think it's actually, Gillian, to answer Amy's question, it's a really, certainly in, am I muted? Okay, sorry, I had my screen saying that I'm live, but I'm muted, so sorry, that truncated me there for a second. It's a real mixed bag, in that I must admit, whenever I kind of came into higher education from secondary, I felt a little bit kind of nervous, and that I was standing out, and then I very quickly realised that a lot of my colleagues did come from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, so from social work, from charities, things like the Samaritans, but also a large number of my colleagues did come straight from university, and they've worked in a variety of different jobs, maybe starting as course secretaries or administrators of various projects and things. And I think even though all of us have kind of been through the university system, you only kind of see one aspect from as a student, and there are so many things going on behind the scenes. So things like widening participation projects, and, you know, students associations. There's always, I want to say random jobs, because I don't understand what they all are, but hopefully you understand what I mean by that. There are lots of different opportunities to kind of get into something that's interesting, and then find out more about what's going on and go, oh my gosh, I'm really interested in this aspect, and kind of, you know, develop your skill set and head off into that. And that is why it's such a fun kind of ecosystem to work in.
Any other panel members got any thoughts of their experience of colleagues who come straight from university or elsewhere? Phil?
So, yeah, I think there are people. So just to add to what's been said there, I mean, sort of in the student support area, we will have lots of sessional staff who do things to assist disabled students. So, I mean, that might be something as simple as, you know, carrying somebody's books around campus who is a wheelchair user, for instance. So there are jobs like that, and there are administrative jobs. There are jobs that, you know, don't necessarily need a lot of experience, or indeed necessarily any experience. But what's good about a role like that is actually it will give you sort of experience that allows you to sort of articulate, you know, relevant skills and experience within the university. Again, I would say go back and have a look at what it says in the person spec. Be realistic. So if you see a job that's advertised that is, you know, saying it's going to pay £40,000 a year, that might be very, very attractive. But be realistic, look at the person spec. Do you meet that in the way, you know, you're going to be against lots of competition, so there's going to be lots of experienced people who are going to go up for a job like that. So I would think, you know, look at the the grades that are lower down possibly, and then think that as a stepping stone to progression. Don't necessarily think it's going to be straightforward that you go into your sort of dream job. You might need a few stepping stones on the way. But equally, as was mentioned, you know, people do go into charities, NHS, social services, schools, all sorts of different areas. So, you know, there isn't one direct way that you can, you know, do this. There are lots of different meandering paths sometimes people take.
Super. Okay, so sort of connected. Couple of questions, and there was one that was pre-submitted. So, do we have any advice for recent graduates who are looking to get into student services, higher education, but with limited experience, and advice on how to get that initial experience? And then sort of connected is another question about whether it's possible to get volunteering or work shadowing opportunities in higher education. So let's start with Benedict. Your thoughts for recent graduates who perhaps have limited experience, how we can support them to get a bit more experience.
Well, I just wanted to agree, firstly, I think Phil made the excellent point, which is again going to be being realistic about where you sort of pitch yourself in terms of applying for roles in higher education. So if you are a recent graduate, I think you are in a very strong position, but perhaps you're not going to necessarily going to apply for an associate dean job straight off the bat. I think one of the things that is really, really valuable in the sector is a fresh perspective. So whether that's from someone coming in from a different sector entirely, or whether it's someone who is a recent graduate that actually can bring that sort of student's eye view into the systems and into the processes. And I certainly, when I work with sort of recent graduates, it's great to get that perspective from someone who's actually, you know, very recently been affected by the kind of decisions that I'm making, and to have that sort of feedback. I certainly know that, you know, if someone comes to me and they're serious about a shadowing or a placement opportunity, then I will really move heaven and earth to see if that can be made possible. And that, I mean, this is where we get into the weeds a little bit in terms of process. University, you know, your institution might have a sort of formal process for that to take place, or it might be that actually as a manager, if you want to accommodate that request, then you might need to go and have some conversations with your legal team. You might need to draw up some sort of loose volunteering agreement with all the necessary clauses around data protection and GDPR and all the rest of it. But I would certainly try and facilitate that opportunity as much as I can. And I think certainly my experience from the teams that I've managed and the teams that I've worked with, people want to tell people about what they do. They want to show why what they do matters and why it's important. And certainly when I've gone to my teams, you know, especially my teams who work in sort of frontline student advice, and said someone's got in touch and says they'd like to actually spend a bit of time, maybe learn a bit about what you do, maybe try it if they, you know, within the necessary parameters, if they get to a certain level of competence, actually maybe have a go as well under supervision. And, you know, I've never once had a colleague say to me, oh no, you know, we wouldn't be interested in that. I think people want to bring people in and show them what they do and why it matters. So if you can get the kind of foundational logistical kind of legal, ethical framework stuff done just internally, I'd certainly welcome people to come in and have a go.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. So I would say we've had to say goodbye to Lorna. So thank you very much to Lorna. She hasn't just disappeared, she did have to leave. Thank you for your contributions, Lorna. I would also say that some universities also run apprenticeships for specific roles. So also always worth to look at that. And also to construe volunteering, you can construe that quite widely. So you could look for opportunities to participate in research. You could look at volunteering if your local education institute has, for example, museums or something that's more open to the public. I mean, probably not at the moment, but in general, open to the public. Think about how you can learn about the university or interact with students or staff in a sort of slightly broader way. Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts, more thoughts about recent graduates?
Yeah, could I just jump in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned apprenticeships. I started my job as an apprentice, and yeah, and it's a great avenue to get into if it's available. But yeah, first step, do your desk research. You know, see what's available, what different institutions offer. There are, that I know just off the top of my head, University of Birmingham, where I did a secondment to, they have a graduate scheme type of thing, but I think that's mostly for those who have graduated from their own university. But there is also something called Ambitious Futures, and this is a program which I think, for example, Oxford may be part of this, about 30 institutions or so, and it is a third-party organisation that specifically does graduate schemes, manages your placements with universities, and the whole point is to develop, to create a funnel of graduates, because there does seem sometimes to be a dearth of young people in HE sometimes. So it's definitely something worth looking into. But picking up on other people's points, contact people, look at where you'd be interested in doing some shadowing, or even just inquiring about any opportunities available. They might even point you to the adverts on jobs.ac.uk, but at least then you've put yourself across their desk. And also, if you're a recent graduate, look back as well as forward. You will have graduated from somewhere. They will have a career service. They will know as well as any, if not better, how to get involved, and how to start your that next step. You should be able to access most of those services for a few years after you graduate. Depends on your institution, but I'm sure they wouldn't turn you away.
Right. Okay, thank you. So we've got a couple of slightly more, I guess, practical questions. So we'll start with Matty Stevens. Thank you, Matty. Suggestions for non-UK citizens seeking jobs in higher education. So this one seems to be about moving from a US context to a UK context. What would be the best way to get noticed? Pursue an opportunity, or jobs you recommend someone who is not a UK citizen to target? Well, I don't think any of us can give out immigration advice, and we shouldn't attempt to. But I think I would just start by saying that I have quite a few colleagues who've come from a different higher education system in a different country, and that comparative angle and the kind of new perspective is often really highly valued. But we always have to do a bit of work in understanding the differences between the systems, and that is, as Jordan would say, it's your desk-based research a lot of the time. That's something that you can do pre-application, pre-interview, but also be completely upfront about the fact that you come from a different context and are therefore will need to get up to speed with the UK context, particularly around things like UK government funding for students, and understanding what the difference between private and public is over here relative to the difference to what it means in the States, for example. And so this is very general advice, but my advice would be to start with an area where there is the highest amount of overlap. So thinking about a colleague of mine who came from a Chinese institution, and although some of the elements of sort of course design and program design were quite different, they actually found themselves very well placed for a job in a general student advice service, because every institution needs to advise their students on personal financial issues. They needed to do a bit of work to understand the answers to those questions over here, but actually those skills are really transferable, and most universities will have some kind of advice service. So those are just some brief thoughts from me. But Phil, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, I think you've given a lot of very useful advice. I think I would find it difficult to add to what you've said, to be honest, Gillian, without straying into what would be immigration-related advice, which I don't really want to do, apart from to say you would need to look at the roles themselves and see whether they were roles which were open to non-UK applicants. I mean, I can't give you any specific advice about that, but there is particular employment law that applies. So you need to have a look into that. So you might want to do a bit of research on that yourself. I mean, the reason we can't give advice about that is because there are specific legal restrictions on who can give immigration advice. So it would be something you needed to, research a bit yourself, I think.
And then similarly, Sarah, thank you, Sarah, for your question. When you moved into HE, has it meant that you've had to relocate? So Sarah's saying she's currently in FE, wishing to make the move to HE, but not many opportunities, I guess, in your area, Sarah. Have you seen any change in roles becoming home-based? Well, temporarily, yes, but I'm not sure about the future, given what a sort of hands-on sector higher education can be. But as we talked about before, it's a very broad church in student support. But let's cover the relocation issue from the panel. Has anyone had any experience themselves of having to relocate for a HE job, and what you thought about when you were doing that?
Yes, Gillian. I worked at Oxford Brookes for quite a few years. Actually, I got my job in higher education as soon as I graduated, so actually very topical. But after a while, it got to the point where, as I mentioned earlier, the only way sort of to move up to the next stage of my career was to move out of that organisation. So I pitched around, and I wasn't particularly bound to any specific geographical area. I just went for interviews sort of all over the place, really. I went down to sort of Chelmsford way, then I had interviews sort of much further north, and just to work sort of a bit aside, check and see if they've got an interview expenses policy, because I was making out like a bandit for a while, which was great, not just petrol, but a nice lunch as well. So that was always appreciated. But yeah, eventually, when I got my job at Aston University, and yes, the relocation was a part of that. But I think it's about being able to cast your net that much wider if you're able to. And I appreciate this isn't the case for everyone, but if you're in a position where relocating is possible, you'll certainly have a wider scope of roles to apply to than if you'll kind of have to remain within a very specific area.
Absolutely. Jordan.
Sorry. Yeah, no, absolutely. I am relocated twice, once for a secondment in the US. The secondments are kind of different, and of course for this job in London. And partly the reason that kind of cart before the horse, I was looking for jobs in London, and then KCL came up rather than I really wanted a KCL job but didn't want to move. And now I'm back in Birmingham temporarily, but that's another story. I still have my job, though I haven't applied. But yeah, no, I mean, I think absolutely cast your net as far and wide as you can. Think about where universities are based, or the access points, and how easy it is to travel. And I know a lot of universities are shifting now to this kind of high flex working and studying, but I can't see there's many roles, especially in student support, that would permit, beyond pandemic times, any kind of permanent home working thing. I think there'd be few and far between opportunities. So like definitely consider, if you're going to go for a role that's now home based, as I've seen some advertised, as my partner is also looking for jobs in HE. They say this, but then also bear in mind that will probably change come summer next year or whenever. So yeah, but like Benedict said, read the fine print, ask about relocation support, policies, annual leave, additions. There's other things, not annual leave, sorry, moving days. Some people even give you relocation allowances, but that's rare, diminishing, and depends on what role you're going into. But yeah.
And I would think very practically, go and have a look on Rightmove, see how much the rent is in these areas. Is it actually plausible to move somewhere else? Benedict will know this, but certainly Oxford is a very expensive city to live in, and so the salary might look generous on the tin, and then you look at the rent and think, how much am I have to pay to commute from where I can afford to live into Oxford to do the job? So do your homework about the area too. I think on the home working as well, I would say some of my colleagues, I think, would really like to have a more flexible approach post the pandemic, whenever that is, and I think higher education can be quite a flexible sector, and we certainly would like to support that in the future. But I'm inclined to agree with Jordan that sort of entirely home-based jobs are going to be pretty rare, but there's likely to be some flexibility in the middle. Okay, so we don't have that long till the end, so I would just like to finish by asking colleagues to give us a couple of minutes on a career highlight that they think would be of interest to our participants who are sort of interested in getting into higher education. And could I start with Phil, please?
Yeah, if I can just be a bit cheeky and add something on the last question.
Yes.
So I do think there may be more roles that offer a little bit more home working than has traditionally been the sense, which might mean that you feel if you're commuting for half your time that you can spread your net a little bit further. And also there's an increasing amount of distance learning. So I mean, if you look at something like the Open University, for example, well, that's almost exclusively distance learning. So you may well find that there are opportunities there that you could look at, and other institutions as well are doing more in distance learning. But to come back to what you actually asked me about, Gillian, a career highlight. So we have developed something at De Montfort University called Healthy DMU. This was a 2-year strategic programme that we were working with people across the whole institution. What it tried to do is develop a whole institution approach to student wellbeing, and you know, universities are massive places. They have thousands and thousands of students and thousands of staff. So trying to do something like that, I mean, you know, might seem quite foolhardy, really. And I'm not naive enough to think that we've achieved everything there is to it. We did achieve some very specific things. So we developed a staff toolkit that means that all staff across the university have access to resources and skills and you know, advice about what to do on all sorts of different student issues. We've developed something called the Healthy DMU Hub that faces students and gives a whole range of different advice and ways of accessing support and activities, and isn't just about making people go and see specialist support services, because actually, you know, sometimes people can deal with things without seeing those things. And we developed a training program, and also got it embedded as policy across the university that we have this specific university-wide approach. So why I was particularly pleased about all this was because when we started talking about this, I was talking to colleagues across the institution and was getting a lot of puzzled faces, and I thought, you know, am I, you know, doing something sensible here? Is this possible? And 2 years later, having worked on it with all these people, I think universally, you know, we were all really, really proud of what we'd achieved. So that would be a career highlight for me.
Thank you, Phil. Benedict.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this before we started today, but I think the most recent one that springs to mind for me is actually an example of just the variety of things you can get involved with in the higher education sector. 2 years ago, we were awarded a strategic investment fund grant from the executive to completely overhaul and refurbish and renovate the student services hub, which is kind of the central physical space where all of our student support services are based within the main university building. And I was given a budget of £20,000 to use to kind of drag that into the 21st century, because it was looking very dated. I'm not an interior designer, I'm not a graphic designer. I hadn't done much in the way of kind of in-depth project management before, but that was so much fun just to get involved in refurbishing that whole area. So going from, you know, picking out swatches of, you know, dealing with the, you know, talking to the furniture suppliers, you know, the kind of the people that, you know, mapping it out, working with the estates and planning team, getting the sort of staff feedback, and how we were going to move forward with the branding and the colours and the walls. And I think the reason that's a highlight for me is because I was kind of given sole charge of making that work and making that an environment that students would want to be in, and a real sort of flagship space within the institution. But sort of on a professional level, it's very visible. And if that didn't work, if that didn't look good, if it was a real turn off for people, if it wasn't a practical, functional space, but also one that actually was a good place to be, that genuinely benefited the students and contributed to the student experience, it would have been incredibly visible that it wasn't working. So I did really feel the pressure to get that right, because it's one of the first spaces you see when you walk into the building. and to kind of be able to say, to go in now and look at it, and well, not now obviously due to COVID, but to know that what's there is something that I was really leading on creating. To me, that every time I go into work and I look around the space and I think, yeah, actually that's pretty good.
Excellent, thank you. And Jordan?
That's a very hard question. I've got 4 things which I'll say very succinctly. The travel opportunities in HE, they can be rare, but they can be great. There's opportunities to get involved in networks, more than you can shake a stick at. There's a conference every week, every day, in normal times. Now it's just lots of conferences online. And the opportunities to get involved in those are incredible, and I've really benefited from that. And it's gave me a lot of opportunity. Another highlight was getting involved in the LGBT network at Aston, kind of reconfiguring that staff network, and then that's now kind of snowballed, and now I'm one of like the founding committee members of a national LGBT network in HE, and that's all just because I responded to an email about looking for committee members, that kind of thing. So that the amount of opportunity is probably the backbone of the highlights for me. The amount of development opportunities, doing an MBA now alongside Benedict for our sins, should be writing our dissertations, but here we are. And I did at ILM in coaching. That there is a lot to reap from working in HE, and I try to be that stone dry as much as I can, just because it really is quite rare and unique. And then most rewarding highlight was whilst I was at Aston, setting up the student projects office, bringing in over 30 students who, for various other reasons, couldn't secure an external placement, so like internship outside of Aston as part of their placement years in their undergrads. And working with them to develop projects, to give them, for many of them, their first ever professional role in project-based work in a professional setting at a university. And the main thing was just seeing how they grew. We had one person who she wouldn't even speak, and then in the end, when we did a showcase, she was the one who wanted to speak first. And that was quite an emotional moment. And so I may have peaked too soon, because that was a massive highlight. And it's just a wonderful thing to do. So sorry, that wasn't one single highlight.
No, that's great. Thank you.
So the highlight of the role that I do just now isn't one particular situation or one particular student. The real highlight of the work that I do just now is in helping students to maintain their education when things are getting in the way. Something I see time and time again in higher education is students starting to spin, for want of a better word. And when you think about it, primary school, secondary school, everything culminates. These young people go through so much to get to university. And when they get there, the expectation of themselves or from other people are that they are adults and they've got this and they've got all the skills that they need. And for some that works, and for some other things start to make that situation become a bit and this is why it's lovely to work in student support services, because time and time again we find ourselves working with students who report back to us that they were about to leave. They didn't think they were going to be able to maintain their education, and more often than not they are delighted at the fact that student support services exist. Many of them don't know that we exist until they suddenly have need of us, and that is just such an important thing, to be there for students and to help them with a life steer and to help them achieve the culmination of many years of education. So yeah, for me that's the highlight of what I do.
And just to close, for me, I would say that a big highlight for me, again, as Jordan says, there are lots of opportunities afforded in higher education. And one of the things that that we set up recently at Oxford in our student services was a mediation service for students who find themselves in conflict with other students, but dealing with it in a very supportive and managed way, rather than having lots of complaints to deal with. And I volunteered myself to become one of the trained mediators and we went down to London and did a training course. And I've got to say, it was a real highlight, and particularly the skills that I learned that I can transfer to other areas of my life are just really, really good. And every time we do a mediation session, it's really great to see what a positive impact we've had on those students and their lives. So that's a real highlight for me. And I think we need to bring it to a close now, because we're nearly at the end. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our panel. Virtual round of applause to everyone in the panel. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. And sorry if we did not get to your question, or if you sent one in advance and we didn't get to it. But I really hope that this was useful. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Stay safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.